Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembrances of the Past, where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a significant effect on our culture, our society, or on history. And tonight we're going to talk about someone who certainly fulfills the bill in all three of those categories. We're going to talk about Steve Jobs. The question I would pose to you is, can a businessman be an artist? Well, as the head of Apple, Steve Jobs was perhaps the most successful business executive of our time, but he was an artist on top of that. And today we're going to talk about how he combined art and business to become one of the most successful entrepreneurs in American history. Steve Jobs' beginnings were modest, certainly nothing to indicate what was to come. His parents were graduate students who gave him up for adoption. He dropped out of college. Growing up in the hothouse of entrepreneurship and the computer pioneers in the Stanford Palo Alto area in the 60s and 70s, he got a job as a boy with Hewlett Packard. He actually called Bill Hewlett once. Bill Hewlett was actually in the phone book when Jobs was about 12 years old. He called him, and Hewlett talked to him for about 20 minutes, and he actually got a summer job there. And he began working in his computer career in his garage with Steve Wozniak, who was his chief engineer. And here's Steve Wozniak telling a little bit about the early beginnings of his collaboration with Steve Jobs.
We went into the garage when we were two young people with no money. You have to work out of your home. We had jobs on the side. We had nobody that could loan us money. We had no business experience. We're like a million young people who are so excited about the future they might have someday in business, making something just out of their ideas. That's what we were. And then I think back to just all the times we had together. Very, very good times that you have when you're young, and playing around with the systems and little misbehavior and doing interesting things. And then he was always thinking about certain technology, the early products that got developed, the building parts, what those might lead to in our future. And he was always pushing me as an engineer. Could you possibly add this someday? Could you possibly add that someday? Yes, 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 I could, thinking, no, it's way, way off. But eventually we all did.
I would submit to you that what Steve Wozniak just described there was more the portrait of an artist as a young man than it was of a burgeoning businessman. In 1976, when he was 21, Jobs built the first Apple computer. And this was the computer that actually made personal computing mainstream. There were a number of other companies working at it, but his was the one that actually made personal computing the primary goal as opposed to a business computer, which is where IBM was targeting its market. The Apple computer gave him the initial funding to create the Macintosh division and introduce the first Macintosh computer about 8 years later, when we'll get to that in a minute. At that point, Jobs was also interested in design, so design was a primary goal of his computer as much as functionality, and he started hiring designers, again, the artist in him. He also paid attention to what Sony was doing because Sony was also a company that he looked at and studied their method of form and function. Certainly the marketing consultant Regis McKenna that Jobs and Wozniak went to describe Jobs more as an artist than as a businessman on their first meeting.
He had cutoffs, he had long hair, he had Birkenstocks. As one friend of mine that I sent him to, a venture capitalist, said, why did you send me this renegades from the human race? You kind of get used to it in entrepreneurs.
But lest you be deceived that you were simply dealing with a bohemian artist, there lay at the heart of Steve Jobs a businessman non-pareil.
I told them, unless they can really start talking in a language that the common person could understand, that they weren't going to go very far. So they left. But Steve called back, insisted that we get together. We did. And he and I got along immensely because we talked more about what was possible in terms of building a computer that was low cost and that reached out and doctors and lawyers and teachers and children could use.
And both as an artist and as a businessman, Jobs had a flair for the dramatic. And here is his introduction of the Macintosh computer, which is a memorable one in the early 1980s.
Today, for the first time ever, I'd like to let Macintosh speak for itself.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It is with considerable pride that I introduce a man who's been like a father to me, Steve Jobs.
Their Super Bowl commercial that showed a bunch of drones working in factories and then having one person smash the screen of the authoritarian figures is one of the most famous television commercials ever made.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. Created for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests, obeying contradictory rules. The rules is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Thus was born the cult of Steve Jobs. But like all good dramas, there was conflict in Steve Jobs' life, and the conflict arose when he was fired from Apple several years later. Here he tells the story.
I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? What had been the focus of my entire adult life was gone, and it was devastating. I felt that I had let the previous generation of entrepreneurs down, that I had dropped the baton as it was being passed to me. That was difficult when it happened, but maybe the best thing that ever happened to me. There wouldn't be a Pixar if that hadn't happened. And so, you move on, life goes on, and you learn from it.
Jobs may have been fired for the very things that made him brilliant: his iconoclasm, his nonconformity, and his non-business business sense. The suits couldn't see the businessman in the artist, and how wrong they turned out to be. When Jobs was fired from Apple, he started the next company, and as he mentioned, he started Pixar. And here he tells the story of Pixar, which became the most successful animated movie corporation in history.
This all started with George Lucas. He had a problem. Now, to describe his problem, let me digress a little bit. When you make a copy of an audio cassette tape, let's say, an analog copy of an audio recording, you get noise artifacts, hiss, right? We've all experienced that. Well, the same thing happens when you make an analog copy or an optical copy of a piece of film. If you copy optically one piece of film to another, you get hiss, if you will, and in this case, the noise artifacts are visual. You get a dirty frame. Well, when George was making the original Star Wars, he had to combine many, many pieces of film together to make one frame. Some with the models, some with the matte paintings, some with the human characters, some with the special effects. And by the time he got through combining all these pieces of film to make just one frame of his movie, it was dirty. And he, being the genius that he was, thought, I wonder if I combine them digitally, if they could be totally clean. Because when you make a digital copy of an analog recording, it's perfect. And it turns out if you make a digital copy of a piece of film, it's perfect.
Sharper, clearer.
Sharper, clearer, without the noise artifacts. So George hired this guy named Ed Catmull, who was at the New York Institute of Technology, to come out and build a computer group for him and to figure out how to solve this problem. And they did. And George was the first one to ever do this. And after this problem was solved, George decided that he'd solve this problem, and he decided he would sell this computer group. And I ended up buying them. I met Ed, and Ed told me his dream was to make the world's first computer animated film. And I bought into that dream both sort of spiritually and financially. And together we started Pixar in 1986.
Well, Pixar became very successful, but Apple was being run by those suits and was being run into the ground. In 1996, Apple bought Next, Jobs' computer company, and this allowed for Jobs' re-entry into Apple and to remake the entire organization. He had talked for some time with Edwin Land, who had built Polaroid and had been the great designer of Polaroid, who had been forced out of his own company, and he realized that this was not a failure on his part, but it was a failure on the part of the people around to realize what he was doing, just like they had failed to realize the technological innovations that Edwin Land had made for Polaroid. Edwin Land once told him, "We didn't create these marvelous things. They were there. They were just waiting for us to discover them." Here's Regis McKenna discussing Jobs' re-entry into Apple in 1996.
When I talked to him on the phone shortly after he went back to Apple the second time, and Apple was in dire straits, and he told me on the phone that Apple, it was, things were worse than he had imagined, that the business itself had really gone downhill, that the technology and the new products and so forth were in very bad shape, and that a lot of the people had to be changed. And I said, "Well, how are you doing?" And he says, "I love it."
One of the myths we can shatter right away with Jobs' re-entry into Apple is that he wasn't a people person. He wasn't always a warm and fuzzy guy. He could even be a bully. But I think you'll see in these two interviews, he talks about how important people were to him and were to his company.
Well, Apple was about 90 days away from going bankrupt back then, in the early days. And it was much worse than I thought when I went back initially. But there were people there who I'd expected all the good people would have left. And I found these miraculous people, these great people, and I said, why? I tried to ask this as tactfully as I could, but why are you still here? and a lot of them had this little phrase. They said, because I bleed in 6 colors. Yeah. Which was the old 6-color Apple logo. And that was code for, because I love this, what this place stands for, or at least stood for. And that just made all of us want to work that much harder to have it survive and have those values survive and bring it back. I've been very lucky in meeting incredibly talented people and hanging out with them. And so that's been my greatest strength.
The next 15 years, not only did Jobs bring Apple back, but he made it one of the highest capitalized companies in the world, and he brought out 15 years of the most innovative products that people have seen in the 21st century. He was businessman, artist, and entrepreneur at the same time, and he didn't do any market research. He said, "We will build the products and then people will want them," because he appreciated what people needed before they appreciated what they wanted. In fact, in some ways, the products were simply delivery systems for what people wanted: music, information, communication.
Things are packages of emphasis. Some things are emphasized in a product, some things are not done as well in a product, some things are chosen not to be done at all in a product. And so different people make different choices. And if the market tells us we're making the wrong choices, we listen to the market. We're just people running this company. We're trying to make great products for people. And so we have at least the courage of our convictions to say, we don't think this is part of what makes a great product. We're going to leave it out. That's what a lot of customers pay us to do, is to try to make the best products we can. And if we succeed, they'll buy them. And if we don't, they won't. And it'll all work itself out.
A lot of companies have mind share. You buy their products because you have to. Apple developed not only mind share but heart share. You bought their products because you have to and because you want to. Here's the introduction of the iPod Nano, the latest iteration of the iPod, which revolutionized the music industry. More than the music industry even realized. They were floundering with what to do with pirating of music, and Jobs changed all that with this.
Now, the iPod Mini is what all of our competitors have their sights focused on. Why? Well, it's obvious. Because the iPod Mini is the most popular MP3 player in the world. It's the most popular iPod, and that makes it the most popular MP3 player in the world. So that's the one everybody's focused on. Well, today, we're going to do something pretty bold. Today, we're going to replace it. We're going to replace it with something new. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because we started this all with 1,000 songs in your pocket, right? We started it with the original iPod. And then we carried 1,000 songs in your pocket over to the iPod Mini. Well, now we're going to replace the iPod Mini with a new player, an entirely new ground-up design that also has 1,000 songs in your pocket. And it's called the iPod Nano. The iPod Nano is the biggest revolution since the original iPod.
People love the products and they love the demonstration. Here is Jobs introducing the iPad. And in fact, I just bought an iPad too. Heart share and mind share.
We think we've got something that is. And we'd like to show it to you today for the first time. And we call it the iPad. So, let me show it to you now. This is what it looks like. I happen to have one right here. That's what it looks like. Very thin. It's just like this. So, let's give you a little overview. It's very thin. And you can change the background screen, the home screen, to personalize it any way you want. People put their own photos on it, I'm sure, but we ship a few and you can make it anything you want. And what this device does is extraordinary. You can browse the web with it. It is the best browsing experience you've ever had. It's phenomenal to see a whole web page right in front of you and you can manipulate with your fingers. It's unbelievably great. Way better than a laptop. Way better than a smartphone. And you can turn iPad any way you want. Up, down, sideways. It automatically adjusts however you want to use it. And again, to see the whole web page is phenomenal. Right there, holding the internet in your hands. It's an incredible experience.
You can see that he talks like an artist when he describes the iPad. In fact, people loved it. The only ones who didn't love his product so much were his competitors. After he introduced the iPhone, here is Steve Ballmer of Microsoft just about dismissing it out of hand.
Steve Jobs goes to Macworld and he pulls out this iPhone. What was your first reaction when you saw that?
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine.
How do you compete with that, though? He sucked out a lot of the spotlight in the last few weeks because of what happened at Macworld, not only with the iPhone, but with the new iPod. How do you compete with that, with the Zoom?
Right now, well, let's take phones first. Right now, we're selling millions and millions and millions of phones a year. Apple is selling 0 phones a year. In 6 months, they'll have the most expensive phone by far ever in the marketplace. And let's see, what's the expression? Let's see how the competition goes.
Well, as of Steve Jobs' death, Apple had a higher capitalization than Microsoft and was leaving them in the dust. So I think we got the answer to that problem. Again, Microsoft, mindshare. Apple, mindshare and heart share. Here's Steve Wozniak describing what he thinks of Steve Jobs as a technical innovator and businessman.
I mean, Steve was clearly the most outstanding business thinker, and almost everybody who's high up in the technology business recognized that somehow he had the ability to think out new ways of doing things, not just ways to improve what we have, do a better version of something, but do it in a totally different way that the world would swing towards. Over and over and over, all the products of Apple, from iPhones and iPads, iPods, these were just unbelievable life changers. We were just the lucky partnership. He was lucky to have me in the beginning, but I am incredibly lucky to him for everything in my life. He gets a reputation for being a strong leader and being brash, but to me, he was just always so kind, such a good friend.
On a personal level, here's Regis McKenna describing what Jobs was like. And you can see that there's an element of the monastic Buddhism that he followed, that he learned when he was a teenager traveling in India about him.
He loved to be at Pixar, at Apple, and with his family. And that's what he would tell you. He lived a very simple life, even when he had a lot of money. His first house, I had a grand piano, an enormous living room with no other furniture. And he's a vegetarian, so he would eat very simple meals. He was almost monastic in his way of life. He certainly drove perfection and excellence into everything he touched.
In the end, it was about the company. He took virtually no salary, preferring shares of Apple stock because he didn't want to lose control of the company as he had done in the 80s.
Certainly wanted to build a great company. In saying to me, doesn't anybody want to build a company anymore? Because the so-called serial entrepreneurs, they start companies and then they sell them, and then they start another one and they sell them. He wanted to build a company.
But in the end, even the company was about the product. This broadcast, the producing, the editing, and everything about it have all been done on Apple devices. You can listen or view this content on billions of devices produced by Apple. Everything about this presentation is possible and easy to understand because of Steve Jobs.
He would push you to the limits. He would push you to look for better ways to implement something. So it wasn't as if he were a great engineer or that he was a great designer, but he knew the product in its conceived perfection. I mean, I would watch him on stage introduce these products, and people would say, well, he's a great showman. But I never thought that at all. He actually was absorbed in the product. I said, if there were no audience there, he would be probably just as enthusiastic.
A compendium of the BBC tributes to Steve Jobs.
One of the most influential thinkers, creators, and entrepreneurs of all time. A genius who will be remembered with Edison and Einstein. A visionary who was bold enough to believe he could change the world and talented enough to do it. Tributes to Steve Jobs from Rupert Murdoch, Michael Bloomberg, and Barack Obama. In the words of the Prime Minister David Cameron, the co-founder of Apple brought us innovative products which changed the way we work and play.
Finally, some words from Jobs himself. Perhaps his most famous speech was the commencement speech he gave at Stanford in 2005. He had already been diagnosed at this point with neuroendocrine cancer of the pancreas, and he sensed his mortality in his words to the graduating Stanford students.
Sometimes life's going to hit you in the head with a brick. Don't lose faith. I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die to get there. And yet, death is the destination we all share. No one has ever escaped it. And that is as it should be, because death is very likely the single best invention of life. It's life's change agent. It clears out the old to make way for the new. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important. Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose. You are already naked. There is no reason not to follow your heart. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary.
Well, on that note, we're going to wrap it up on Steve Jobs. But before I do, I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And I want to thank him tonight more than most nights, because not only is he the person who got me turned on to Apple equipment, without which we could not do these presentations, but he knows an awful lot about Steve Jobs and an awful lot about Apple. And he gave me a unique perspective that otherwise I don't think I could have provided for you. So thanks a lot for that, Sid. By way of closing, we're going to close with a Steve Jobs voiceover on the Think Different campaign that he launched several years ago. And then we're going to end with a snippet from one of his favorite songs, John Lennon's Imagine. So we say goodbye to Steve Jobs, definitely a businessman and an artist. And to paraphrase what Hemingway said about Mona Lete, it's quite possible the mother of the next Steve Jobs has not been born yet.
Here's to the crazy ones, the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them, because they change things. They push the human race forward. While some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do.
So, you like everything so far? Good.